All right, so this video is going to go over the brain in detail. So we're going to start out with learning the lobes. So looking from the side here, we're going to have the frontal lobe here, okay, both sides, both hemispheres. You find your central sulcus right here, and then behind the central sulcus would be the parietal lobe. Back here on the back, turn this around, you see the occipital lobe, and then here on the side is the temporal lobe. Now that's 4 of the 5 lobes, and so we're missing one. The 5th lobe is called the insular lobe, and to get to it, we actually have to open this up right here. I'm going to take this piece off, and there you can see peeking back at us right here, this is the insular lobe. So again, let's go over those. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and insular lobe. All right, some other landmarks we need to know are longitudinal fissure and our central sulcus. So go back to the color-coded one, central sulcus, which gives us on the frontal lobe here, our precentral gyrus for motor function. And back here, the back, we have our postcentral gyrus, part of the parietal lobe, and it's for sensory function. Okay, some other things that we need to talk about, the connections inside the brain. We have this structure called the corpus callosum. Now, it goes across the brain from one hemisphere to the other. So I have 3 sections of the brain here, so you can see this large crest right here, and on this model it's right here, and on this model it is right here. Those all represent the corpus callosum. So any brain model that's in sagittal section, that's what it's going to look like. And we're going to look at it as kind of like this area of the brain is like a seahorse. And so it's kind of like the crest on top of the seahorse's head. Now, if you come to this model represents the corpus callosum a bit differently. So I'm going to take off these hemispheres here, the tops of these hemispheres. Okay, and looking down at it like this bridge right here, this green and tan with the fibers that look like they're going across, this is what represents the corpus callosum. Okay, so it just looks a little bit different because, again, we're looking at the brain, a different section and from a different angle. Okay, next, we need to know the fornix. Now, the fornix on this one, since I'm on this model, I'm going to pull off the corpus callosum. And it's the myelinated axons of the neurons that are part of the limbic system. So this green structure underneath here represents the fornix. Now, on our other models that are in sagittal section, we have up at the top, we have our corpus callosum. Then we have that thin membrane called the septum pellucidum. And then this white structure here is the fornix. Looking at this one, the white structure here is the fornix, and looking at this third one, the white structure here is the fornix. Okay, now the basal nuclei, they are only visible on this model brain, okay? We call this the puzzle model. I'm gonna pull some more pieces out, okay? And this one's about to come off anyway, it's okay. So just under the insular lobe, okay, I'm gonna pull this off, and this is gonna be between the insula and this is the outside of the thalamus, and this whole piece comes off, and this is where the basal nuclei are located. So as I pull it off, I can see the insula part, I can peel this part of the model off, and when I take that off, I see this red structure in here that looks kind of like a jelly bean. This whole thing, this whole piece that I can pull out is the lentiform nucleus. So first of all, let's point out, number 1, it wouldn't be red. It's gray matter in a sea of white matter, so it would just look a little darker gray. Secondly, you are only responsible for knowing this outermost layer that is visible as soon as I take the insula piece of plastic off. So this outermost layer here is called the putamen. Okay, the innermost layer of the lentiform nucleus is called the globus pallidus. And again, those two together give us lentiform, which means like lentil bean, which is kind of what it looks like. All right, now there is this structure holding and going between this nucleus and this other nucleus on the back. And what is this? This is a bunch of projection fibers that are creating what we call the internal capsule. So I'm going to put this back in, and it would be positioned like this in the brain. Oops, it just fell out again. And so between the lentiform nucleus and this nucleus, which is another one of the basal nuclei called the caudate nucleus, Between those two would be all of those projection fibers making that ridge right there that's tan. My pinky is touching it. That is called the internal capsule. All right, so on this side, I mentioned this is called the caudate nucleus. Caudate means tail-like, and it kind of does look like a cat's tail if the body of the cat was over here, and then this came off the body and wrapped around, and there's the tip of the cat's tail. All right, so those are the basal nuclei and the internal capsule. Next, we want to look at the inside of the brain, the diencephalon and the brainstem and associated structures. So these three are all done in sagittal section, and I'm going to focus in on this part here. And again, I want to teach this to you kind of like a seahorse. Okay, so we have this ridge over its head. Okay, this will be the head of the seahorse. We have this swelling here that is the eye, and this dot that is the pupil of the eye. And then we have the seahorse's mouth here, neck and belly, and then down towards the tail. Okay, so we're going to teach those parts of the brain in accordance with the seahorse. I have these three. I also have created a diagram here. Whoops, I'm going to back up some more on the whiteboard. There we go. All right, can you guys, hopefully you can see that, where I've just drawn out those pieces. So I'm going to kind of pan around so maybe you can see all of the labels. Okay, hopefully you already got it down in class, but just in case you didn't, that is our giant seahorse drawing. Okay, I'm going to go back to the model and go over each piece. Let's see, you have three different models here. So again, this upper ridge is the corpus callosum, then comes the septum pellucidum, then comes the fornix. Now, right after the fornix on this model, it's blue and red, is this structure here. That is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, because the third ventricle is actually right here, right in this area. We're right in the middle of it. Okay, on this model, they've also made it red and blue for the choroid plexus. And on this model, it is also red and blue. If you were to take apart this model, it's just red. All right, that represents the choroid plexus. Now, the thalamus is actually huge. This is half of the thalamus, and the other half of the thalamus is over here. But when we cut it in half, we only get to see the very central swelling, like here. And then we get to see exactly where the thalamus sends one piece across to the other half to connect it. So this little pupil of the seahorse's eye, the whole eyeball here is the thalamus. The pupil would be the intermediate mass of the thalamus, or called the interthalamic adhesion. Either of those names would be acceptable. The nose of the seahorse, down to the beak kind of area here, is the hypothalamus. The very tip of the beak would be the infundibulum. And on one of these, nope, none of these has the pituitary. It's actually on the other half. So here it is from the other side, other half of this model. So right here coming out of his mouth, you see this stalk here. This is the infundibulum. And then this pink structure here represents the pituitary gland. Also under his chin is a bump. Now, since we are looking at one half of a brain model, and there's one bump here, that means that normally there would be two if I had the other half. And we would call those the mammillary bodies. Remember Barbie boobs. Boobs come in twos, and they're on the front. So on the front of the brainstem would be these lumps right here. All right. So those are the mammillary bodies, and they are part of the hypothalamus. Moving down, we enter this region, which is the midbrain. Now, on the front, the midbrain is kind of underneath where the mammillary body is hanging down, but we also see these fibers going up towards the top in the peachy color. Those are the cerebral peduncles. So on the front of the midbrain, you only see cerebral peduncles. On the back of the midbrain, we're going to see one more structure from the diencephalon. Here is the pineal gland, sometimes called the epithalamus. And then we have these two lumps. There's one here and one here. Now, again, half a brain, which means I'd have two upper lumps and two lower lumps. The upper lumps are called the superior colliculi. Each one would be a superior colliculus. The lower lumps would be the inferior colliculi. Each one would be an inferior colliculus. These are relay stations for vision and hearing, and the group of them all together, which would be 4 bumps total, would be called the corpora quadrigemina. So that is the important thing on the midbrain. Also running down through the middle of the midbrain, remember we were in the 3rd ventricle. This is the long, narrow tube that leads to the 4th ventricle. So this structure here is the cerebral aqueduct. So midbrain has cerebral peduncle. You can kind of see the mammillary body in front of it, part of the hypothalamus. And it has the corpora quadrigemina and the cerebral aqueduct. The next section of the brainstem is here. And this, from here to here, is the pons, all the way back to here. The pons means bridge, and it's the bridge between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So one way to know you're on the pons is the fibers decide to go across because they're primarily communicating this way and not up and down. And for this part of the test, you only have to know that that is the pons. And then the last section of the brainstem here is the medulla oblongata. You can just say medulla for short. Although they are not required, I highly recommend that you identify the pyramid. Let me try to prop this up here. Let me prop it up over here. Nope, not working. All right, not the best today. Sorry. But this ridge right here on the front is the pyramid. And then this pink shape right there, it's kind of a big, long, 3-dimensional oval, is called the olive. So knowing where the pyramid and the olive are on the medulla will actually help with the next lesson, which will be for the cranial nerves. Okay, the last section on the brain that we're going to go over is here. This is called the cerebellum. And on the outside of the cerebellum, you see that it does not have gyri and sulci. Instead, it has folia, which are fold shapes. When I cut into the cerebellum, I get this beautiful tree pattern here. This white matter pattern is called the arbor vitae, for tree of life. And then also, if I put the 2 sides of the cerebellum together, like that, you notice that there is this funky little wormy shape that's running right between the 2 halves. These are the hemispheres of the cerebellum, and this is called the vermis. So vermis, folia, hemispheres of the cerebellum, and inside the cerebellum, arbor vitae. Those are the major parts of the brain in detail.